But your presence here and your really helpful, and thank you massively.
You might not say that after we've said what we've got to say.
That's true. Yeah. Okay. Welcome to this episode of The Future We Build. I'm super excited about this episode. I've got two guests today who were there when it all started for me. Julie Hirigoyen, ex-CEO of UK GBC, now NED and advisor to a range of investors and property companies, and Sarah Ratcliffe, CEO of the Better Buildings Partnership. Both Julie and Sarah were the co-directors and leaders of the small consultancy Upstream that I joined back in 2006. So this is where it all started for me, and it's great to be able to come full circle and discuss with them, what progress we've made as an industry over the past 20 years, where we find ourselves now, and looking ahead, what's needed. We really pick up on topics such as collaboration and the need for collaboration within the industry, the skills that are needed, and we reflect on actually what we want from our urban spaces and the reliance that we have on nature and our communities. It's a great discussion with two powerhouses in the industry. Let's dive in. Thank you both for joining me here on The Future We Build. Real privilege for me to have both of you here with me today. So we've got Julie Hirigoyen and Sarah Ratcliffe. And why this is really important, probably obvious for you too, obvious for me, but for the listeners, this is where it all began for me, is, back in 2006, I think it was, when I joined Upstream. I think it was 2006. I think I was the 8th person to join that team. And obviously, what happened since then and the journey that we've all been on. So I was really keen when I was thinking about this podcast, and as I say, the stories that I wanted to tell and reflect on was, for me anyway, going back to the beginning. And actually, we had I recorded an episode with Robbie Epson and Emily from Savills, and we were talking about what was and how it's gone, and just the journey that we've all been on. And I guess one of the things that came out of that, and it'd be good to get your reflection on this, is it felt like the first sort of, we were saying this earlier, like the first 5 to 7, 10 years, when it was hard, it was challenging, we were all kind of like fighting a good fight, but it felt like we were really creative. We were like really coming up with some interesting solutions. We were, getting in at the C-suite level, and it felt like, certainly from a personal perspective, like we were really kind of challenging the status quo and being really creative in the solutions that we were coming up with. And the reflection, certainly from the session I had with those, was, obviously there was a great positive step of a lot of the industry, onboarding people, bringing in-house teams. A lot of that went in-house. But perhaps coupled with regulation and some of the other issues and other drivers, that some of that creativity maybe sort of slipped away, and a lot of it became a bit more compliancy and tick boxy, and obviously the whole reporting. So anyway, that was a very quick, but it was an interesting sort of takeaway from that you would ironically, because you would think perhaps as we progress, things would get easier and things would get more creative and things would get more innovative, but actually it felt like perhaps not. So anyway, I'd be good to get your impressions on, what your thoughts are about where you started, what you wanted to achieve when you started, how that sort of arc to now has sort of been for you, and where we are today. Is it where you thought we'd be? Julie, do you want to start?
Sure.
Big question.
Very big question. So I think it's worth saying that we started sort of almost 10 years before that.
Sure.
Late 1990s was Sarah started a year before me, I think, in environmental governance, as it was then called. And it's probably worth just reflecting back on that, because actually at that point it was really just about the vision, and the ambition was just to put environment and environmental risk and management on the map for property kind of investors and developers. By 2006, I think we'd already grown quite significantly. There were 35 people in the Upstream team. We'd renamed the organisation, and it was very much more focused on sustainability, not just environment. And so even in that decade, there was a massive shift. And I would agree with you that because of that, the early years were really about environmental awareness and kind of board level engagement. And we always used to say we were banging on closed doors. We kind of were.
Yeah,
no one had this on their radar. So in that respect, those, when one looks back over that decade, there was massive progress because suddenly many of the propcos, many of the listed companies, many of the institutional investors were starting to recognise it as a mainstream investment risk or business risk, and certainly environment, and we're starting to embrace sustainability and the wider socioeconomic agenda. I think we had to be super creative because we had to make processes up to integrate this into their mainstream decisions. So everything was much more bespoke to the organisations and businesses that we were working with. And if you fast forward to kind of 10 years ago, maybe even mid 2015 kind of era, a lot of it had been already kind of turned into toolkits and certification ratings and GRES systems, and so it's become formulaic in a way, non-creative, and tried to be systematized, and I think that's lost some of the bespokeness of it, and perhaps also some of the nuanced what it means to different businesses. I'll pause there because I could carry on, but I'd like to give Sarah a chance to reflect on that. But it is worth, I think those first 10 years were like awareness raising, and then it was kind of embedding into core systems in a bespoke way, and then it was systematizing, and and hence where we are.
Which is probably worth saying, that was, I guess, always the goal, right? Is how do we embed this? How do we get this systematized? How do we get investment committees? How do we get regulators? How do we get... So in a way, that was always the goal anyway.
Those first 20 years, I would say, achieved a lot, took too long. In a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, I think Julie's described it very well. I don't really think I have a huge amount to add to that. It's a really eloquent description of the different phases we went through. I think probably, the significant things to emphasise in terms of those first phases were that we went in at board level. So it was just, it was trying to put environment and sustainability strategically on the map at a board level. And then once you had done that, and it was about the basic building blocks, to remember where we started, very, very straightforward things, which now you look back and think, well, there aren't many organisations who don't have those things in place, but it was really quite basic. But I think Julia's described it well in terms of saying, well, actually, then, the next kind of decade or so was all about embedding. I agree with Julie that the pace at which that happens was, is quite slow when you get into sort of changing processes and systems and, kind of really embedding things. You have to build the systems and processes, but then you have to bring people on board, and that takes time. I think from a sustainability perspective, we would all like to have seen that happen a little bit more quickly. I think one of the challenges around that is almost what got embedded and systemised and what got filtered out during those stages as well. And so there is that kind of, that there was an inevitable way in terms of kind of governance, transparency, reporting, which then you have to narrow down to, okay, what is it possible to report, what is possible to measure, but also, in terms of the scope, then the capacity of organisations to take on sustainability holistically, is limited. So it was necessarily kind of narrowed down to sort of a smaller number of challenges, if you like, that were then systemised. And there are still some that are not,
It's interesting that just reflecting and thinking the things happen by accident or by curation, but there's obviously now a huge focus on decarbonisation. There's an entire industry, energy management of energy platforms, energy optimization. There's a huge stack now of companies trying to solve that problem, and it's almost as a direct consequence of that evolution that you've described, which is, well, what can we measure? Well, we can measure energy, and there's an ROI to that, obviously greater one now than there was, and that became then, I suppose, the language that often was talked about, and it's well, this is the one thing that we can actually manage and measure and then actually do something about, and it spurned an entire industry, which perhaps, in bringing us to kind of present day, is almost sort of taken over the agenda somewhat from all of the other issues that we felt were important and sort of, as you say, sort of got filtered away. Is this just sort of big machine of decarbonisation and net zero, which is absolutely needed, certainly in the sector that we work in. But it's just interesting. Because I don't know whether it's what drove what, but it
is the single biggest impact of this sector. It's 25% of our carbon emissions in the UK, directly from buildings, and that's not counting infrastructure and all of that. So I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think we had to focus on the most material things, otherwise we'd have not done anything. The piece of that frustrates me is that it was single-mindedly and has been for so long about operational energy and carbon and not about the whole life carbon. And so even though those discussions now are, I remember when I first took over, the UK GBC role, embodied carbon was quite contentious for us to focus on as an organisation, and I didn't quite understand why. And when you look at the sort of, that increasingly it's going to be like more than 50% of a building's footprint. So we all know those stats, and yet that's still not regulated. It's still pretty difficult to do. We still don't have to your point, the kind of solutions and the tech and the data that we need to really take that seriously, or indeed the alternatives, right, from a materials point of view and a design point of view. So I think even with the biggest impact and even with such a singular focus, we're still only looking at less than half of the pie. So it goes to show how complex and how slowly we're going. I personally think if we'd gone at that pace with everything, all of the different impacts, we'd have got frozen out, and we wouldn't have made any progress.
That's a fair point.
But I
was at an event this morning actually, and it was a bit sort of like moment. Is this 2015? Like it was talking about embodied, and it's really important, and it's okay. And what struck me was the conversation was around value, and it's like, well, tenants demand it or investors want it, but because operational carbon is what they can measure, that's the currency or that's the language that they're speaking to them about. But they're missing the broader picture, which is they're picking building A over building B because it's got a good operational footprint. What about the whole life carbon footprint? And actually building A or building B might look very different if you were to provide that whole picture, but we're not. So almost decisions are being made based on a small subset of the information, which it's very difficult, very challenging.
I mean, I think in a way, sorry, just to get very specific, I also think that depends on the different players and where they intervene in the process. So with whole life carbon, really critical to understand that as a whole picture. But actually, if you're if you're very transactional in the market and you're transacting existing buildings, then that carbon's already spent, and it's how you account for that, how you then bring that into a forward-looking perspective, and think about the risks and opportunities associated with that. So I think there is a challenge around that. But to come back to this point around creative thinking, I think, perhaps where some of the creativity now is about beginning to make the connections, the tentacles that come out from that very specific focus on energy and carbon, and realising that actually if you look at that as a single issue, what it does is its tentacles reaches out. So, how we address mitigation then leads you on to thinking about are we going enough? It leads you into the whole question around adaptation and resilience, and it leads you into the whole area of nature and how those different things interact. And you were talking about creativity. I think that's where the creative thinking is at the moment. How are all these things interconnected?
I fully agree with you. I guess I struggle to see, and I don't know whether this is a human trait, but people need examples, or they need to see what does that actually look like. And I think the picture you're painting, which we can all sit around and sort of discuss and understand from a sort of conceptual perspective, but actually seeing what does that actually look like for a building or for an asset or for a portfolio. I can't point to an example where that's scaled. And I think that's perhaps one of the challenges is we understand what a decarbonised building looks like or an energy efficient building looks like. There's kit, there's tech, it looks like this, there's ways of designing it. But when you start to think about, as you say, that more holistic, I don't know, it's sort of, hearing you speak, it's like, where can I go and see what that looks like?
I think
to give people an idea of that.
Yeah, I think that points to one of the fundamental flaws of a a market like real estate, or an asset class like real estate, is we're generating income streams from a fixed built real asset, that is very difficult to change, inherently very costly and difficult to change, and is very illiquid in some ways. We transact them frequently, but it's quite a big deal. So and also it's so inextricably driven by its sustainability, is inextricably driven by its context. So we're trading on a kind of a very singular level, and actually the real physical asset is in a really complex, kind of rapidly changing, physical and economic context and social, and that just the two don't quite meet. So to your point, if we think about something like nature, that's really hard to do something meaningful on one building. We know that, right? But if you've got a huge regeneration site, like, a big urban regen site like King's Cross or somewhere, it's much easier. And in fact, you almost can't not do it, because you've got to think about flood risk, and you've got to think about overheating, and you've got to think about people's quality of life and health and well-being and air quality, etc. So it's the same sort of thing. It's like if you're trying to do adaptation on one building, you really haven't got much chance, whereas you need to look at what neighbourhood is it sitting in, and where the local, hydrological kind of, flows, and what's the drainage like. And we can't think in the way that we think transactionally about some of these very connected systemic problems.
Because I've thought about this a lot, actually, is in terms of and we've seen it in London, right? You mentioned King's Cross, you've got British Land, Earls Court. There's these big developments where mixed use, there's infrastructure, and that, as you say, that allows that single entity to think more holistically about inputs and outputs. And whereas you say, I'm transacting a building in the City of London, what can I do? And so, I guess from a leadership perspective, are we now starting to see those that control sort of, I guess, fundamentally larger footprints and have those different inputs and outputs, just because of need? Ultimately, there is actually a need to consider these wider impacts versus, and then I suppose, is it therefore unfair to expect the single asset owner, because they just don't have there isn't that externality that they don't see the externality that they're at risk to? And I guess with that, is there then a role, or what is the role of the government or the municipality or whoever it is to try and bring that? I don't know. I just think as you're talking, it seems to be the trend, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is really challenging. I think also to kind of just think about it in the wider context. I totally kind of agree with what Julia said in terms of actually the way we treat buildings as a single, entity, which is disconnected from, around that in terms of how investment decisions are made and so on. But I also think there's a context there in terms of the types of investment vehicles, the types of portfolios. So, equally in the same way, if you're investing in an area in a big regeneration project, you can see where all those connections are. If you also have long-term patient capital, then you can actually, the way you approach that prospect is very different to if it's a very short-term, highly transactional. I suppose what I would say is that in terms of sustainability, and thinking about the sector as a whole, it's thinking about how it's kind of a dual thing, really, about how you challenge that, but also work with it. How those investment vehicles are constructed is kind of outside, if you like, where the sustainability kind of professionals work. But there is a relationship there, challenging those investment vehicles, challenging the investment criteria on which they're based, but then also kind of working, well, if you have got this type of investment vehicle, here's the most material things you can do. If you've got a long-term patient capital, big projects, there are probably other things that you can do. And it's sort of a more nuanced approach, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things going on in my head around, the resilience of that investment asset, whatever you want to call it. If I was in a capital investor and I was thinking about over the next 30, 40, 50 years, does that mean that those that control a bigger footprint and can control some of those externalities are in a better position to be more resilient, and therefore is that asset and that investment going to be more resilient? That's a hypothetical question, but it's an interesting one. But I think it opens the door to, we talked about this before we started, the role of kind of like industry bodies, and you mentioned the word collaboration, of where you do have investors or holders or managers of individual assets, but they're all next to each other. Pick the City of London or the West End, right? We've got lots of members of the PPP, they all own those buildings, but they all think about them in very much in isolation. Is there, what is the role, I guess, of the industry body, and is there a role, and is there an ability to think about, or how do we start to think about that geographical location that has support, can sort of support and contribute to resiliency?
I mean, I think that the construct of place is much more conducive to doing what we need to do to make the built environment, in its kind of broader sense, more sustainable, to drive more sustainable outcomes from how we use, manage, invest in, develop urban spaces, which therefore means, because it's fragmented in ownership and the owners of the different parts of it are not even in the same kind of category. Some might be infrastructure, some might be local authorities, some might be landowners. You need the collaboration. You have to get that collaboration. That's the bit that, in a way, these kind of formulaic tools that have targeted very single kind of users have, that's what those things are great for them to systematize sustainability in their processes, but it doesn't deliver the wider change that's required. So it can be a bit tunnel vision and not necessarily, and have unintended consequences potentially. Not to say they're bad, just more to say we need both and. And so that's why I see the role of industry bodies as grouping them together so that they're at least, there's consistency and commonality in how they're all doing it, so that we're not measuring apples and pears, but then also to bring others to the table. And I feel like as an industry it's still quite siloed and insular. Real estate doesn't often connect it with energy. I mean, that if we want to decarbonize built environment, we need the two sectors literally hand in hand. And there are plenty of other examples, right? So I feel like that's the bit we haven't got to yet, and I think there's a big role for that. We often talk about radical collaboration, and that is where it needs to happen. Is kind of genuinely new commercial models of ways of working that knit these different interests together, so that we are doing it in tandem and together with other sectors. The local authorities would come into that, right? I mean, adaptation and resilience, we've mentioned a few times, you just can't do it. So you can't expect the building owner to do it on their own. They've got to connect with other building owners in that place, and with the local authority in that place, and the public authorities and the highways, and then you get some meaningful action. And there were some really good examples internationally of sponge cities, or those have all happened from not one body or one organisation, but multiple government-backed initiatives. No, I mean, I totally agree with Julie on that. And I mean, I think this idea of place, and actually kind of getting greater collaboration there is really critical. I think, the other way in which we need to collaborate is all the organisations working together. I mean, there's obviously different cohorts. Kind of they're different. There's a cohort in place, but also there are, there's obviously the private sector, the public sector, but then there's professional institutions, industry bodies, trade associations, membership organisations,
all through the value chain.
all through the value chain, and I suppose. I think that in terms of actually moving forward with that collaboration, that then that ecosystem of different organisations needs to work more effectively in a very symbiotic way. And be kind of rationalised, right? I mean, there's too many. I mean, I don't know any other industry where there's as many as there are down the construction and property value chain. I'd be interested to know that. I think in our sector, we tend to look at our sector, and because we're in it, we know all those different organisations. I'd be interested to see if other sectors had, a similar complexity of complexity of
it is mental when you just list out and you think the construction sector, then the architecture, and then the planners, and then the owners and the managers, and they're each talking about their own bit. And rather than thinking, I mean, I asked a question at the end, but we've kind of already answered it, which is like, what is it we wish for? And I think clearly collaboration is going to be one of those things. But I mean, it's, I guess, in some ways, I mean, and thinking internationally, there are obviously countries and cities where they're starting from a blank piece of paper, and it's just, this is the master plan, this is what we're going to build. And therefore, I don't know, you could argue both sides, but they can sort of think about all of these different externalities from day one and plan the city, plan the town, plan whatever it is. Whereas in Europe traditionally, and certainly in the sort of older cities, we're dealing with what we've got. And we've obviously, certainly in Western Europe, we've got a lot of this, as you say, high value real estate. And so there's going to have to be, from government or industry bodies or another there's going to have to be a way of trying to get the sort of geographical piece to sort of knit together and think about, okay guys, how do we all sort of contribute into the resiliency of this place? And that isn't just fabric, right? That's also how do we continue to attract people? How do we get the best people here? There's so many dimensions to that, as well as just the sort of traditional. It's going to be interesting.
I also think that it's really great to have examples of where those things are working well that we can point to, and I think that's really critical. I also think it's really important just to acknowledge that in terms of all of the buildings that exist, all of the communities, all of the locations, you tend to find that those examples are in urban centres or where there's a definite confluence. And I think the secondary, this kind of what we call a bifurcation of the market, where you've got, prime locations, prime assets, big urban regeneration projects, you can see how that can kind of stack up. I also think as an industry, we have a responsibility to think about how that impacts on, the secondary markets as secondary locations and, what that means, and actually think about learning from those examples and how they translate, or whether there's a different model needed for those other locations, because, we tend to focus on the big cities.
I would agree with that. I mean, I
leadership, but I think we need it all.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's the long tail, right?
The current political discourse doesn't help with that, because actually, when you think about it, of course, these topics, climate and others, have been politicised, and I don't blame, in a way. I'm not surprised by that, because there's an easy narrative to spin that this is going to cost more and it's going to undermine our standards of living and blah, blah, blah. There's an equally good and strong argument to be made that actually in places that really, where the disenfranchised kind of voter is likely to be, they're hollowed out communities with really, tired and ineffective buildings with very few sort of opportunities for jobs and whatever, one can paint pictures. Those are the places where actually revitalizing the urban fabric could provide a huge number of different opportunities. Lower bills is an obvious one, but new skills, new jobs, a sense of pride in the community, quality of life, air quality, it's just multiple kind of benefits on benefits. And so it's deeply frustrating in some ways that actually we're not looking at it in that respect and thinking, well, actually the real estate component or urban renewal could drive all of these societal and economic outcomes that we're all craving, and environmental, and therefore we need to kind of incentivize, and through whatever it might be, through government taxation, through whatever it might be, that over and above many other things that we're incentivizing, like oil and gas subsidies, because that's going to be at the core of people's experience and daily life and blah blah blah. So it's quite perverse, because I think a lot of those are the secondary, tertiary places where many investors wouldn't touch with a barge pole for good reason, but actually need to be kind of rethought from the bottom up, and that would actually lead to many better outcomes. So it's just, I find it really frustrating that the kind of politics is moving against.
Yeah, it's where that collaboration is key, isn't it? Because in order for the private sector to be active in those places, they need the confidence to do that, and part of that confidence is through...
Which doesn't take much from the government to give that, right? But it just needs to give certainty and a bit of longevity to, we're going to do this, now come on board with us. And I just, exactly as you told me, I was going to ask the question, where we find ourselves now, sort of, the last 20 years of progress, and we sort of find ourselves at a point where, I don't know, in some days, I turn on the news and it's like, oh my God, have we gone back in time? Or, we seem to be going down a different path to the one that I thought we were on. And obviously, we don't know what's going to come tomorrow, but there's paths that go in a place where I don't want to go. And maybe we won't go down there. But to your point, the loudest voices around use and politicizing and using, and I think it's energy and carbon has sort of captured the sort of taken the sustainability word and made it its own, and it's been, as you say, sort of made a dirty word. But as you say, where are the voices to say, hold on, no, this is a huge opportunity. There's jobs, there's low cost to reduce low cost of living. But it's just been it's just the loudest voices are the ones that are saying.
I take some hope from the fact that there's an inevitability, both in, this is where my hope and despair come in equal measure, but the inevitability of the science, which is becoming so obvious and frankly undeniable, and so impact upon impact upon impact. You can't keep denying it, right? It's happening, and we are losing, I can't remember the last count, 120 trillion or something last year in the top 10 climate events globally alone, right? So it's just ridiculous. Yeah. And that's going to keep happening. And the economic the sort of lack of the sheer speed with which many of these technologies are becoming cheaper, both to install and invest in and to operate. So I think, yes, there's a huge narrative and a huge, sort of powerful movement against it, but those drivers are going to, any foresighted business and private sector in particular is going to say, well, the mood music is one thing, but the economics is another, and it's going in that direction, whether we like it or not politically. So I'm going to put my chips on that bit of the deck or whatever, and invest in that.
I think I would certainly reflect that kind of, alongside all the noise, alongside all that rhetoric, that because the science and the evidence is there, and because it is being acknowledged as both a risk and an opportunity, the work continues. Underneath all that kind of noise and hubris, that from a private sector perspective, from an investor perspective, it isn't something which is a judgment call. It's based on kind of evidence and risk opportunity analysis, and that that work is still going on. The
fastest growing bit of the economy. Well, if we had double-digit growth in other areas like construction,
why are they not shouting?
We'd be laughing.
Why are they not shouting about that? It's bizarre.
Exactly.
I had Vincent on from Green, the investor network, and exactly that. I also asked that question: is thinking about it from an institutional money coming into real estate. He's like, well, we think long term. These issues are long term. Of course, we're going to continue to invest in it. US is a slightly different story, and there's some perhaps illogical, decisions being made, but that are driven by, politics. But generally, certainly in Europe, it's we'll follow the money. We follow the risk. We know where the risk is, and we're going to. And as you say, there's the opportunity. And then again, the irony is when you look at countries like China, they're doing some great things. They're doing some not so great things, but the economic boom, certainly within the clean tech industry, is just phenomenal. And yet in Europe and America, we're saying, where's the opportunity? Look what they've been doing. So, it's kind of odd that for whatever reason, the voices of the sort of anti-voices have become the loudest voices that have sort of muddied the water a bit.
Tech and social media might have something to do with some of that.
It could well do. So I guess, that's where we are, challenging times and however long they'll go for. But I guess thinking about both yourselves in terms of, what you want to be doing, what you are doing, what you think you'll be doing in the future. I'm obviously spending a lot of time thinking about that now. I'm just curious to kind of get your thoughts about where both you will be going and what you want to be doing going forward, and where you think the market either needs to go, should go. I guess what your message is to the listeners out there, if they're in real estate companies, whether it's heads of sustainability, whether it's CEOs, whether it's service providers, whoever it is, kind of just curious to kind of get your thoughts on where do we go from here.
I don't know what time horizon you're looking at, but if I look forward 20 years, I might not be around. So let's be serious. And by 2045, we need to have pretty much eliminated all our emissions. So we've got quite a bit to do in that time period. I'm not going to give up on it because that's what's needed. I don't, I think we have to keep. I think when we've squeezed the time frame so much that it will be much more painful to do. But I think when some of the sort of, the things that kind of keep me up at night are things like tipping points and the science. And once some of those which are imminent start kicking in, I do think that we will, human ingenuity will kick in and we'll try and sort it out. But it will be quite late. So I think the window of opportunity to do that is definitely in the painful zone now. It's going to hurt.
Yeah.
Sarah quite rightly pointed out reflected back on when we started, we engaged with chief execs and C-suite, and I feel like that's what's been lost a little bit in the kind of systematization which has to happen. There's been an eye off the ball from the real leaders, and actually those leaders have changed over time and I just think we need this to be absolutely baked into and kind of well understood and part of the legacy of those who are at the very helm of these organizations that are producing the to your point, the future that we build, right? That is their legacy. So we've got to somehow get back to a place where leadership, genuine leadership, represents stewardship, custodianship, and future, safeguarding for the future. And I would, that's where I'm spending my time now, because I feel like unless we get it baked in at that level, we can do all this stuff that we want underneath, but there's no real accountability. So boards and NEDs and chairs and CEOs, and they have to get that this is their job, not the people who come behind them. That's non-negotiable, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess I agree with that. I guess I don't see it in a sort of we always talk about things in a binary way: do this, don't do that, do more of that, do less of this. I don't see it like that. The challenge is of such magnitude. We need to do it all, and we need to do it at a faster pace to effectively make sure that very last bit isn't so painful that it is incredibly disruptive. So I think in terms of where that focus is now both sort of as an individual, but also thinking about where we need to go as a sector, I think it's about being really incisive in those different places, understanding what's needed at board level, understanding what's needed in the implementation, and also the pace at which that needs to go. And I think within that there's where are the opportunities for leadership, what is going to kind of, as Julie says, kind of bring those boards back on board in terms of actually kind of making sure that leadership is there, spotting those opportunities, but not only for individual leadership, for collective leadership across the industry. And I think there's that whole point around it's not just how individual organisations move alone, it's how we move together. So I think probably I would say that, wouldn't I, given the role I'm in as, in terms of Better Buildings Partnership and the Green Property Alliance is, let's not think about this individually, let's think about it collectively, how we can demonstrate leadership and move forward. So, also kind of valuing all of the other stuff that needs to be done, resourcing it, supporting it appropriately to make sure that can move forward as well.
So we started at the beginning saying that the last 20 years progress was good, but it went too slow. So everything you're saying, I mean, hand on heart, do you genuinely think, when the people that you're meeting with, the people that the leaders that we've got, are you hopeful that, because we need to make that change quicker than the last 20 years, right? So, do you feel confident that we have the right skills, the right people, and that's all there, and it's poised to deliver that, or are you nervous given what's going on and perhaps just where we are and how it's structured?
I definitely don't feel like we've got all the right skills, and that we're there now. Personally, no. But I have to remain hopeful. Otherwise, I don't know that there's any point in doing what we do.
Yeah, quite.
So I think, I guess, going back to what I just said earlier, that the penny is dropping increasingly fast, and despite all of the sort of political noise and rhetoric and geopolitical, setback, it's almost like some people call it the last thrash of the dragon's tail, isn't it? Like what's coming after that. And I mean, my hope comes as much from kind of community, what's happening in communities, and people are taking the initiative and saying, well, we can't wait for top-down change anymore, but at grassroots level, there's a huge amount of stuff going on. There's community interest companies being set up all over the place, schools putting PV on their roofs, homes, streets retrofitting together. I mean, there's a real groundswell, and I think that's really exciting, particularly in the built environment, actually, because it is a physical kind of, that's our neighbourhood in a way. So I take huge hope from that, and the fact that at pace there is a changing of the guard happening at those upper levels of organisational leadership. I don't think we're there today, but I think it's worth going after in terms of,
got to become hopeful.
Yeah, and I'm a natural optimist, and like Julie, I do sort of believe that the human ingenuity, creativity, is there. It needs to be unleashed. And
it needs to be in the right place, and it's not all doing AI or something else. But
I mean, I think
what could help.
Well, I think that's the thing. A part of that creativity, a part of that ingenuity, is about learning what skills are needed in the right places, but also how things like AI and technology can help and assist in the right places. So I mean, I'm an optimist, so I naturally remain hopeful. And when you see the communities of people and I use communities in the wider sense of people who are working really hard to make this happen, whether this is at board level or to a very local level, that's what brings me hope and kind of keeps going.
A question I ask everybody, and we've kind of answered it. So if we don't. You don't have to answer it with something else if you feel like we've already covered it, but I ask all my guests, like, if you could get one thing changed from government, business and or individuals, and it could be all three or just one of those, what would it be? I mean, we've kind of talked about collaboration, we've kind of talked about the sort of spatial element of it, whether there are things there, but if there's anything that you would want to say or add in, then is there anything? I mean,
I'd probably go a bit sort of,
it could be a bit of a magic wand one. Like, if you can get them to do one thing, what would it be?
I'd change their mindset.
That's a small one.
I'd change them. I mean, a really obvious part of that is focusing on outcomes rather than, inputs and processes. And so really religiously focusing on outcomes and being clear what good looks like and what we're really striving to do and not, but it's okay because we're measuring and we're doing this and we're doing that. That's just like, let's think about what we want to achieve.
What do we want to get to?
And let's measure what we want to achieve. Yeah. If we just did that, everything else will start falling into place. So that's one example of mindset. I could go slightly more deep and spiritual, but I think you'll want me to.
But I think it also goes to the point we talked about earlier, which is I think we need to give people examples of what does that look like. But I think certainly I'm a visual person, and I think real estate is a tangible thing. We look at it, we feel it. It's like, tell me what, show me what does that actually look like. So the message out, I suppose, is leaders, those that are out there that are doing some really cool stuff. Tell me, show me. We can share it. But I think I think a lot of people need to see what that looks like. Anything from you?
Yeah, I mean, I'll maybe start really specific and then go back out again. I mean, I think underlying some of what we've talked about, and I know it's quite specific and incisive, is data.
Okay.
So if I was to do one that, I think all markets can be creative, can be innovative, but quite often what they need is kind of data to help support that. And I think in the real estate industry, we've had so many different attempts to make data available to market, and for one reason or another, we still haven't got, whether it's embodied carbon or whether it's operational energy, if we could just have that information more freely available to help people inform decision makers. There's a really incisive, kind of very specific example of one thing I would like to see. I suppose at a deeper level, I suppose, Julie talked about changing mindsets. I suppose my kind of more sort of existential thing is about this issue of connection, so that everybody begins to see how things are connected, which is related to your point about changing that mindset, is that all of these things are connected, and ultimately at the nexus of that is the planetary boundaries within which we operate.
Do you know what? I mean, we talked about it before we started. Is that the I guess the schools from which we came through and how we learn, that was just built into our DNA. Is we're just how we all survive and how we. And I don't know. You sort of wonder, but the generations that follow and those that didn't go through that schooling, I suppose, is that there just seems to be a complete disconnect from. I live in a city. This is my job, and my work's online. And what's my connection to nature? What's my connection to clean water, to clean air, etc.? And there just seems to be that's lost. And I know there's a big movement that's happening around like getting people back into nature, and that's that seems to be happening quite a lot. So I'm all for that. But it's sort of placed at that point, right? Is we almost need to re-educate people, certainly those that are in positions of authority, just understanding how this all kind of knits together, because you can't. It's
the interdependency.
That was going to be my deepest spiritual point. We've ended on that note.
There we go. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time. I pretty appreciate it.
Welcome.
We finished on time, hopefully, for you to make your next
Thank you.
So, thank you both. That's it for this week's episode of The Future We Build. I want to thank you so much for listening to us wherever you are. If you're navigating these same challenges, from pricing in climate risk, decarbonising buildings, or if you're scaling a new product or solution, join us on LinkedIn. Search for me, Alex Eds, or follow our official page at The Future We Build. That's where we break down these episodes further, discuss the topics and discussions, and connect you to the leaders engaged in this mission. This show and the guests I invite will be influenced by the conversations we have on LinkedIn. So if you have ideas or would like to hear the thoughts of an industry leader, let me know, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you there. You can find the show notes and full transcripts on our website. And if you found today's session valuable, please hit subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thank you for listening. I'm Alex Eds, and I'll see you next time.